Uh, let's just wait for a few attendees to come in.
I think we might still be in the prep session, no? Don't we need to move ourselves to the actual webinar?
No, we are on the actual webinar now.
Ah, okay.
Okay, so I can see we have now 20 attendees. So good morning, afternoon, and good evening to everyone. So my name is Claire Miranda. I'm from the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. Let's just wait for a few minutes before we start the session because I heard that we have like about 300 registrants for this session. Let's just wait for them to come in and join us. Maybe some of them are having technical difficulties. We'll start in about 2 minutes.
Claire, you are on mute.
Thank you for that, Victor. So yes, again, good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. I'm Claire Miranda from the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and I will be moderating this session of the GCF Watch webinar series. So we are going to start our session 2 now. As mentioned, GCF Watch is a civil society initiative led by CSOs from the Global South, created to improve access to information on anything GCF related, enable better stakeholder participation, and basically empower the people and communities on the ground with regards to the operations and activities of the GCF. Victor, if you can show the next slide. So before I go into the session proper, I will just quickly run down our usual house rules. So as you can see in the slide, we have interpretation for this webinar session. Just look for the globe sign at the bottom part of your Zoom panel, and then choose the language that you prefer. So we have interpretation for English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. I'll just wait for a few minutes for people to figure that out. Next slide, please. And Victor, next slide. Yes. So there. So it takes everyone's commitment to create a multilingual virtual convening. So we ask for everyone's support with the following instructions. Next slide, please. So we encourage everyone, especially our speakers, to speak at a slower pace, speak loud and clear, one person at a time. You can also start by saying your name each time you intervene or deliver your intervention in our webinar. Also announce the language that you'll be participating in. Take a pause after phrases to also allow our interpreters to catch up with the interpretation. And when you're not speaking, please mute your mic. Yes. Next slide, please. And also, since I know most of us have become Zoom experts by now, you know that under a webinar format, participants have no control over their mics, but should any of you have questions or comments that need to be raised, please feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A box. Also, at the bottom part of our Zoom, you can see there the Q&A box. And then also our panelists will try their best to answer your questions during the discussion and or during the question and answer portion or open discussion portion of our webinar. For documentation purposes, this webinar is being recorded. So please let us know if you wish to remain anonymous in our recording and documentation. Also, we have a total of 90 minutes for our webinar. That means we have to be efficient with time. We encourage our panelists to deliver their respective presentations within 8 to 10 minutes. I'm saying 8 to 10, so we can still squeeze enough time for open discussion. And since this is our second webinar session, so we had our first session for 2022 last June 1, where we talked about the GCF Watch platform itself and the opportunities it provides for CSOs. We also looked into the last GCF board meetings that happened this year. So we had two, the B31 and B32, and we reviewed some of the key issues that the GCF Observer Network monitored and raised our interventions on during the board meetings. And for this session, which is session 2, you can see there's CSO-led monitoring and evaluation of GCF approved projects. We are to look into at the implementation of projects approved by the GCF. So over the years, we as civil society and members of the GCF Observer Network, we have put a lot of attention in the review of funding proposals presented to the board. But once these funding proposals are approved, there is little follow-through or even getting enough information or update about the status of the implementation of the projects. It's quite challenging. So at this session, we're going to have a deep dive into the implementation phase, including the pertinent issues around monitoring of projects. And next slide, please. So we have 5 panelists for this session. So as mentioned, it's 5, so we have to be very efficient. So Berta Argueta of German Watch will be sharing what are the different roles of the different actors in the implementation of projects approved by the GCF. And then she will be followed by Mr. Peter Carlson from the Communications Associate of the GCF Independent Redress Mechanism to also share what's the role of the IRM in terms of the monitoring and implementation of projects in the GCF. And then Mr. Said Chakri of the Association of Teachers of Life Sciences and Earth of Morocco will share their experiences of monitoring the implementation of projects in Africa. Titi Sontoro of AXI for Gender, Social, and Economic Justice will also do the same, share what are their experiences in terms of monitoring the implementation of projects in Asia, particularly in Indonesia. And last but not the least, Tara Daniel of the Women's Environment and Development Organization will share about looking at the implementation or monitoring of GCF approved projects with a gender lens. So looking at specifically at the gender action plans. And after hearing all 5 panelists, we'll proceed to open discussion where participants can freely ask questions, share their insights and comments with the webinar topics. So that's a quick overview of what we are to cover at this session. And without further ado, I'd like to call on our first speaker, Berta Argueta from German Watch, to kick us off with the first topic. Over to you, Berta.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks everyone for the organization of this event. I'll try to be very brief because this is just setting the scene for the most interesting part, which is really like the experiences on the ground. So let me just share my presentation real quick so that we can move forward. Is that visible?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So as I said, just the idea is to introduce the different roles of the different actors in the implementation of projects approved by the GCF. So as I said, trying to be very brief, just to show you a little bit what the very basic structure of the GCF is at the international and the national level. And I will start from the top, from the bottom, because this is where all the implementation, like the more directly linked stakeholders to when it comes to implementations are. The GCF works, as some of you may already know, through accredited entities, meaning that only those organizations that have been accredited to manage funding from the GCF can access this funding. And these accredited entities are in a way the more directly linked to the implementation of projects. At the same time, you also have executing entities, the accredited entities of the GCF, which can be national or international organizations. Usually will, not usually, but often will use executing entities, which are other institutions or organizations, including civil society organizations, to implement wholes or parts of their projects on the ground. So those two, let's say, types of organizations are the ones more directly involved in implementation. Either accredited entities implementing directly or accredited entities implementing through executing entities. And as I said, those accredited entities and executing entities can often be either national or international institutions. They can be from the private sector, from the public sector, banks, UN agencies, multilateral development banks, all sorts of different organizations. But obviously, everyone else has a role in the implementation of projects. The international structures, I mean, well, actually, coming back, sorry, to the national, I didn't include this in the presentation, but there is a role that I find particularly important, and I don't think it's fully clarified in, or maybe my colleagues can have other things to say about this in the implementation. The GCF at the national level also works through national designated authorities or focal points in the different countries where they have operations. These national designated authorities or focal points are government organizations or offices that are in charge of, in a way, managing the relationship with the GCF via whether it is via planning processes concerning GCF programming, but also, for example, when an accredited entity wants to present a project to the GCF, they require a no objection letter from these national designated authorities, meaning that in some way the country endorses this kind of project being presented to the GCF. And so even though you can argue they don't seem to have a direct role in implementation, I think they actually can have a very important role. Even though, as I said, it might not be strictly codified as in the policies, it is important because they are somehow also key in ensuring that what is being implemented with GCF finance through accredited entities actually responds to the needs and the objectives of the country. And that's a very important role, even though it is usually, let's say, taken by different countries and different national designated authorities in different ways. So moving forward, just to say, like, I mean, the international structures of the GCF have less of a role in implementation, but they do have an important role in I would argue, in monitoring and evaluation of these projects to ensure that what accredited entities and executing entities are achieving at the national level can actually be monitored and assessed in a broader sense as well. So you have the GCF board, which makes the core decision it's the core decision-making body, the ones that decides basically which funding proposals, which projects get funding from the GCF. They don't manage everyday business in the GCF, so it's not like they look directly at implementation, but they do, let's say, look at overall assessments of how the portfolio of projects is doing, and normally can make decisions about, high level policy of the GCF based on these types of assessments. And the GCF Secretariat, who is responsible for the daily management of the fund, does have a sort of role of coordinating day-to-day activities, and it would be or should be more also involved in following implementation via the reports that accredited entities are supposed to share on the progress towards implementation of projects. I already looked at this, so just to close, because as I said, I am trying to be very brief so that the most important part of these presentations can have more time to be presented and also for discussion to be open. I would really like to share some ideas of what civil society organizations' engagement is in the implementation of projects in the GCF. So obviously, this is also not a role that is fully codified, let's say, in policy in the GCF, but there's many ways in which civil society organizations engage with the Green Climate Fund or can engage with the Green Climate Fund in implementation. For example, civil society organizations can be part of the project coordinating structures and project monitoring structures under the accredited entities, if such structures exist. Normally, a project would have some sort of steering committee or technical committee that is there to provide, like support in implementation or feedback on, and to a certain degree, sometimes decision making on the implementation of projects. And depending on obviously how open this process is, which is not always the case, civil society organizations can engage in these coordinating structures and monitoring structures within countries. Civil society organizations can also be executing entities. I mean, technically, they can also be accredited entities. I just didn't want to add it here because becoming an accredited entity to the GCF is quite hard. There is not that many civil society organizations that are there. It's not a specific restriction. So civil society organizations can become accredited entities. They just tend to not be able to go through the process because it's quite a complicated process, not adapted to the realities. Yes.
I think your slides are not moving. Is it just me, or we're stuck with the first slide?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was talking to all of this without realizing that they were not moving. So I'm probably sharing something else.
No problem.
Okay, well, just to move to the last one, because I was trying to show this different structures, but clearly I skipped all of that and just go to the last one, which is where I am now. My apologies, technical issue. I think also civil society organizations can support the inclusion of representatives from the communities where the funding proposals, the projects and programs that are being implemented are located. They can critically accompany potentially harmful projects or programs and create public awareness if any problems occur. And this can also be, done through the independent redress mechanism of the GCF, which is something we're going to hear about in the next presentation. Civil society organizations can also support local communities and beneficiaries that are potentially affected by any harmful project or activity funded by the GCF to file a request under the independent redress mechanism so that their concerns are being heard by the GCF and accredited entities overall. They also can follow monitoring and evaluation, not only within structures. I think we'll hear a little bit about this as well, but monitoring and evaluation, civil society-led independent monitoring and evaluation is also a way of engaging with the GCF. So beyond the monitoring and evaluation that is done by accredited entities, civil society organizations can also do their own independent monitoring and evaluation of projects. And finally, civil society organizations can always contact accredited entities and national designated authorities focal points to get more information, documents, and just funding proposals and any publicly available information on implementation of projects, whether it is a focus on gender policy, on stakeholder consultations, on environmental and social safeguards and how these are being implemented in the different countries. All of these are roles that civil society organizations can do, and the means in which they can engage in implementation of project with the GCF. And with that, I'm really sorry that you couldn't see my presentation, but I would like to stop here and just leave the floor to the other speakers to give us more of an idea of what this actually looks like on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Berta. No worries about the slides. I'm sure we will be sharing your slides to all our participants, to our registered participants. And thank you for highlighting the very important role of the NDAs, the accredited entities, so that CSOs can actually get more information about the approved projects that are happening in their respective countries. And thank you for reminding us that even CSOs can conduct their monitoring and evaluation of these approved projects. And now shifting to our second speaker, we have Peter Carson from the Independent Redress Mechanism. And as you have heard from Berta, there's actually a mechanism under the GCF should there are issues or problems or concerns about approved funding proposals implemented in your respective countries or regions. There's the Independent Redress Mechanism. And with that, I call on now our speaker, Peter Carson. Over to you.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you for having us and organizing this this event. I think it's especially interesting to be able to talk to the CSOs, which we work with quite a bit, and I'm hoping that this information is quite relevant. If you can move to the next slide, please, and the next one. I first want to point out the fact that, and this was mentioned a bit briefly before, but the IRM, the Independence Redress Mechanism, is one of 3 independent units of the GCF. And so as you see kind of on the left side, we're separate from the Secretariat. And I think this is quite an important fact to know. We report directly to the board, and the establishment of the IRM, as well as the other independent units, is rooted in the GCF's operating policies and procedures. As you can see from this quote here, which is taken directly from there, the board will establish an independent redress mechanism that will report to the board. The mechanism will receive complaints related to the operation of the fund and will evaluate and make recommendations. So if you move to the next slide, I have 3 kind of main pillars that I think is kind of important to the identity and understanding what the IRM does and how we operate. Like I said before, we are independent of the Secretariat. We operate independently, and we report directly to the board. We are not involved in the creation, origination, implementation, or monitoring of the GCF projects. And so we can't, address specific project-related questions. So these are kind of some just important facts to know about the IRM's operating procedures and kind of how we function. If you can go to the next slide, please. These are the 5 kind of core functions that we do in the IRM. The first being the reconsideration of requests. So we can address requests from developing countries for the reconsideration of board decisions that had previously denied funding to a project or program in that country. On the advisory level, based on lessons learned on cases and international practices, we can provide systemic advice to the GCF board on policies and procedures with an eye and objective of improving performance and outcomes. On the capacity building side, we work with GCF direct access entities to help them build capacity related to grievance redress mechanisms and procedures. On the outreach side, we often work with CSOs. So, at some point we might reach out to one of you to help us organize an outreach event where we seek to increase awareness about our work and share lessons learned about our experiences with other stakeholders as well as the general public. And this last part on complaints and grievances, I'll get to a bit more in detail in later in my presentation. And this is where we address complaints and grievances from persons who have been adversely or negatively impacted by a project or program funded by the GCF. If you can move to the next slide, please. So I just want to give, before we get into the grievance and redress or the grievance and complaint aspect, I want to just, highlight the fact, and this was mentioned before, about finding information about the project. And this obviously can help anyone in the general public, especially a CSO, to kind of gather information about a project and monitor its outcomes. If you go to the next slide, just give a really brief overview about where the information is found on the main website of the GCF. Obviously, the IRM, we have our own separate website where you can obviously find more information about us, but just highlighting where it's located on the main GCF website. If you go to projects and programs, here you can click on either countries or list of projects, and you can find information about the projects and programs of the GCF. If you move to the next slide, please. Once you find one of the specific projects or programs, it'll take you to this page where you'll find all the information about the project, its description, the status, the value amount that's been funded, who the accredited entity is, and then also the relevant documents, which can be found on the bottom of the page. So this would include such documents as the funding proposal, gender action plan, environmental and social safeguards report. And so this kind of can provide a basis for finding information about a specific project or program in your country, and then help you then kind of, if you were to want to monitor where the status of the project or program is, this should provide a kind of initial area of research. Now, I want to go and mention, if you can click on the next slide, an important aspect about information disclosure. There is, if you are not able to find information you're looking for on the specific project or program page, you can request additional information through the Green Climate Fund by using an online form, as you can see a link there, where you can specify what kind of information you're looking for. And after 30 days, the Green Climate Fund should provide information or give reasons according to their policies for why they cannot. And if the request is denied, you can appeal the decision within 60 days. So this is just to mention, there's supposed to be an ample amount of information about each project and program on the specific web page, but you do have the option of requesting additional information if it is not publicly available. Now I want to talk about the option of filing a complaint. So if we can move to the next slide, please. And the next one. So this is coming to our website, the IRM's website, where you can see here on the case register section, you can both see a list of cases that we are currently in our portfolio, as well as a link to actually file a complaint, which can be done on behalf of an individual or with the help of a CSO or other group. Now, if you go to the next slide, a complaint, when can it be submitted to the IRM? Yes, you can click on, the next. Perfect, thank you. A complaint can be filed before the project has even been implemented and even before it's been approved, as long as the project is being actively considered for funding by the Green Climate Fund. Complaints can also be filed during the implementation of the project, as well as up to 2 years following any harm that's been discovered. So this is just to point out the fact of when complaints can be filed. There's before, during, and then even up to 2 years after the projects. If you move to the next slide, I wanted to highlight, this is kind of giving you an overview of what happens when a complaint is filed and the steps that we follow. As you can see here, a grievance or complaint should be filed by a person, group of persons, or community who have been or may have been affected by the adverse impacts of a GCF-funded project or program. If you move to the next slide, it's important to note that there are certain things that the IRM cannot address. The IRM cannot process complaints related to fraud, corruption, GCF finances, or human resources. These are tackled by another independent unit that I mentioned earlier, the Independent Integrity Unit. And we cannot accept complaints not related to the GCF project. Complaints regarding the adequacy of or inadequacy of GCF policies and procedures, complaints already addressed by the IRM, unless there's new evidence, malicious, frivolous, or fraudulent complaints, and those used to gain a competitive advantage. So this is just kind of an overview of the things that we do not address through complaints. But if the eligibility of a case has been accepted on our behalf, then there are two main kind of steps that we go through next. If you want to move to the next slide. So yeah, once it's been accepted, once it's been deemed eligible, the complainant or complainants can choose between two different processes, which can also be run in parallel. The first is problem solving, which aims to help the parties find practical, mutually satisfactory solutions to the concerns raised by the complainant. It doesn't seek to assign blame or determine who's at fault. It's a voluntary, participatory, flexible, confidential, and facilitated process. And then the second option is a compliance review. And this is an investigation to determine whether a project has failed to comply with relevant Green Climate Fund policies and whether the non-compliance has resulted in harm. And this is more of a technical process that ends in an investigation report that is then submitted to the Green Climate Fund Board, where they then make a decision on whether redress is deemed or whether they decide on providing the complainant redress. Now, based off of one or both of these scenarios, the IRM then monitors the outcome, whether it's from the problem-solving agreement that was decided between the parties, or whether it's the recommendations that were put in place by the board through the compliance review process. So there is this monitoring of the kind of agreement that has come about from this process, and then the case is closed. If you move to the next slide, you might ask yourself, especially for the compliance review part, what kind of recommendations and what kind of remedies could be put in place through a complaint. So it might be compensation, it might be consultation within the project and program development and implementation. It could be if someone was impacted by their livelihood or their income and their job, alternative transport, or in a scenario in a video that I think will be shared on the last slide. We have a video online with an example character named Asha that I recommend. I'll try to share it in the chat after this. It could be the example of providing an alternative transport and overhead bridge to be able to access my job. So that is just an overview. I wanted to give an example next on our next slide of an actual case that we've managed to maybe put all of this into context. In February of 2020, we received a complaint about the GCF funded project FP43, the SAIS water conservation project in Morocco, which focuses on transferring excess water from the REMEDIES dam to the SAIS plain region. And here the complaint raised issues around the sufficiency of the consultation conducted and the lack of information provided to the complainant and others who were affected by the project, or who are being affected by the project. The complaint also raised concerns relating to the lack of information and communication on access to water and the affordability of that access. And so the parties in this scenario agreed to use the problem-solving process. So the complainant and the Moroccan Ministry of Agriculture and Maritime Fisheries ended up reaching several agreements, and then the complainant subsequently withdrew their complaints. So then the case was closed. So this is one of the examples of our cases, of one of our previous cases. But as I mentioned before, you can go to our website and see all of the existing cases, previous and ongoing. So yes, this was an overview. I hope if you have any questions, happy to answer them at the end. And I'll pass it back over to Claire.
Thank you, Peter. So thank you for giving us an overview about the functions of the IRM. Also, I just discovered that complaints can be filed under the, even before it is approved. So it's important to note that before it's approved, during, or even after, files can be complained on a particular approved funding proposal. So thank you for that. And now to move to hear the experiences of our colleagues from Africa. So we have Said Chakri from the Association of Teachers of Life Sciences and Earth of Morocco, who will share about their experiences of monitoring the funding proposals approved in Africa. Said will be speaking in French, so please turn on your respective interpretation channels to yes, go ahead, Saïd, over to you.
Merci Claire, c'est très gentil. Alors, merci à tout le monde. Bonjour du Maroc, de Tanger, je suis de Tanger. Bonjour tout le monde. Je vais essayer dans ce moment-là de vous présenter un peu l'expérience marocaine dans le cadre d'un projet que nous avons mené avec l'appui de German Watch. C'est plutôt un partage d'expérience. C'est plutôt, si vous voulez, des bonnes pratiques qu'on essaie de partager avec vous. Alors, je vais essayer d'abord de vous rappeler une chose très importante, c'est que nous sommes ici au Maroc comme société civile marocaine, grâce bien sûr à l'événement, surtout la COP22, nous sommes organisés comme société civile autour d'une alliance marocaine pour le climat et développement durable, chose qui nous a permis un peu de se concentrer sur les questions de climat. Comme vous savez, la société civile, d'une façon générale africaine, elle était surtout orientée beaucoup sur tout ce qui est question de l'environnement. Et lorsqu'on parle question de l'environnement, on parle question de l'eau, la question des déchets, de l'énergie. Mais la question du climat, c'était un peu quelque chose spécifique à certaines associations. Mais si on parle de la question finance-climat, c'est encore un peu nouveau pour nous pour parler comme société civile sur la finance-climat. C'est pourquoi il était très important pour nous de découvrir, si vous voulez, cette thématique de finance-climat, et grâce à l'appui d'un projet REMEDIES que German Watch nous a accompagnés depuis 2018, on a commencé plus ou moins à s'intéresser à cette thématique et à travailler plutôt dans le terrain. Mon exposé va comporter un peu 4 points. Bien sûr, il faut connaître la question d'état des lieux au Maroc de la finance climat. Bien sûr, le Maroc, comme tous les pays, ils ont mis en place une certaine gouvernance pour, si vous voulez, cette question de finance climat. Nous avons un point focal, mais nous avons, si vous voulez, un ensemble d'acteurs, normalement des ministères, pour plus ou moins travailler ce qu'on appelle le comité de pilotage autour de cette, si vous voulez, autorité nationale désignée. Là, c'est seulement étatique. Mais nous avons un comité consultatif où peut-être la société civile est intégrée. Mais croyez-moi, cet organigramme, il est depuis 2018 et on n'a pas encore siégé, on n'a pas encore vraiment mis en place ce comité consultatif que nous, société civile, nous devons plus ou moins à donner notre avis, donner un peu notre contribution à cette gouvernance étatique. Malgré tout ça, nous pouvons dire qu'au niveau du Maroc, il y a quand même certaines institutions qui commencent à impliquer la société civile. Notamment, nous avons une commission nationale sur changement climatique et biodiversité. Nous avons une place. Nous avons aussi un centre de renforcement de compétences 4C. Nous avons quand même un collège de la société civile. C'est un début, je pense que c'est très important. Aussi, au niveau du Maroc, nous avons beaucoup de projets. Nous avons maintenant, si ma mémoire est bonne, nous avons une dizaine de projets qui sont financés par le Fonds vert climat au Maroc. Mais pour nous, société civile, on s'est intéressé d'abord à 4 projets. Ce sont des projets portés par des agences accréditées nationales. Nous avons un seul projet, mais il y a aussi 3 projets qui sont portés par une agence multirégionale ou internationale, comme par exemple un projet porté par l'AFD et un projet porté par la Banque européenne d'investissement, la BERD. Et je remercie le dernier intervenant de l'IRM qui a parlé un peu du projet de CEIS qui est porté effectivement par la BERD, et on peut, si vous voulez, discuter sur ce point-là. Alors aussi, on a comme je vous ai dit, le constat général de la société civile marocaine sur la question climat, bien sûr, comme je vous l'ai dit, que très peu d'ONG marocains s'intéressaient au sujet de la finance climat. C'est pourquoi nous n'avons pas, si vous voulez, un recul, une expérience dans ce domaine-là. Mais nous avons quand même des actions sans limiter à des participations aux ateliers nationaux ou parfois à des rencontres. Si vous voulez, nous n'avons pas vraiment un renforcement de compétences de la société civile. Et pour la question de concertation, pour être juste, rarement nous sommes comme société civile concertés, soit par les porteurs de projets, soit par les agences accréditées pour effectivement partager des informations sur ces projets. C'est un constat que je pense que toutes les associations africaines, parce qu'on a échangé, nous avons quand même ce point-là, qui ne sont pas ni concertés ni avant le projet, ni pendant le projet. Donc, c'est un problème majeur. Nous avons, pour effectivement remédier à ça, nous avons créé une alliance marocaine qui peut regrouper pas mal d'associations, bien sûr, avec l'appui de GREMEDIES. Dans cette expérience marocaine, on peut la subdiviser en deux grandes parties. Nous avons une première partie qui a été tout simplement pour le renforcement de la société civile marocaine. Nous avons profité de deux actions qui ont été portées par des ONG africaines, notamment un réseau climat et développement, et surtout sur la question fonds d'adaptation. Depuis 2014, nous avons eu la chance de connaître ce fonds d'adaptation, donc nous avons pas mal d'expérience sur ce sujet. Nous avons aussi profité de l'occasion, avec aussi l'appui de GREMEDIES, appui de certaines organisations, pour participer à certaines rencontres, notamment à Bonn, sur cette question de finance climat. Nous avons aussi la chance d'avoir participé à ce dialogue Fonds vert climat et Afrique, surtout à Bamako, lors d'une rencontre où nous étions invités par la société civile africaine en 2018. Tout ça nous a permis effectivement d'essayer de partager ce savoir-faire avec l'ensemble de la société civile marocaine. C'est pourquoi la première phase, c'était une phase de renforcement de capacité, surtout des associations au niveau national. Nous avons organisé avec l'autorité nationale désignée pas mal de renforcement de compétences. Nous avons aussi essayé de diffuser ces messages lors surtout de certaines rencontres qui se sont déroulées au niveau du Maroc. Nous avons aussi, et c'est une chose très importante, nous avons pu mobiliser l'autorité nationale désignée et surtout le ministère de l'Environnement. Et ici, Madame la ministre, il était avec nous lors de cet atelier pour montrer quel rôle peut jouer la société civile, qu'est-ce qu'on peut contribuer dans ce sens-là. Surtout, la deuxième phase, c'était 2020-2022. Alors, cette phase, c'est un peu spécifique. Pourquoi? Parce qu'après cette première phase qui est surtout nationale, on a essayé un peu de descendre, surtout dans les régions où il y a des projets. Pardon. Donc, c'est pourquoi on a choisi deux projets. Un projet au nord-est du Maroc et un projet au sud du Maroc. Et où nous allons quand même penser à une démarche. Parce qu'on ne peut pas travailler comme ça si on n'a pas une feuille de route. Donc, on a dit qu'il faut déjà consolider cette bonne relation avec le ministère de l'Environnement. C'est très important parce que le ministère de l'Environnement, il est devenu du côté de la société civile. Mais surtout aussi, il faut penser à la société civile locale et non pas seulement nationale. Parce que ceux qui connaissent un peu le projet, c'est surtout les acteurs locaux, c'est surtout la population locale. Et c'est pourquoi nous avons plus ou moins sensibilisé cette association locale. Mais nous avons essayé aussi de se rapprocher des agences accréditées porteuses de ces projets, notamment l'Agence de développement agricole qui est une agence nationale, notamment l'Agence française de développement qui est une agence ou régionale, et nous avons aussi contacté la BERT. Et croyez-moi, le premier contact que nous avons vu avec ces agences accréditées, les agences accréditées ont été surpris que la société civile parle de ces projets, parce que ça montre qu'il n'y avait pas de concertation. Ça montre que cette absence de concertation avec la société civile n'était pas pensée lors de la mise en place de ce projet. Et nous, pour être plus forts, le quatrième point, c'est que nous avons mis en place au Maroc une plateforme nationale des ONG spécialement Fonds vert climat pour faire le suivi et évaluation des projets. Je pense que cette plateforme, ça nous a aidés parce que, à force de parler de finance climat, il faut quand même que la société civile se spécialise. Et nous avons fait des formations, surtout avec le Covid, nous avons fait beaucoup de formations de distance. Mais le plus important, c'est que nous avons descendu dans le terrain et nous avons fait des visites de terrain. Ces visites de terrain, ils ont été, toutes les visites de terrain que nous avons fait jusqu'à maintenant 3 visites, il nous reste une dernière visite, c'est nous avons fait une élaboration d'un rapport. Et le rapport, c'est le rapport de notre visite en concertation avec les acteurs locaux, mais en concertation avec les agences accréditées aussi. Et nous l'avons dit comme ça, voilà, nous avons repéré pas mal de dysfonctionnements. Est-ce que vous avez de réponses? Si vous avez de réponses, essayez de nous donner ces réponses avant de diffuser ce rapport. Et croyez-moi, cette méthode, après, nous avons diffusé ces rapports et nous avons profité, et peut-être c'est une occasion de le dire, qu'il y avait une petite évaluation du Fonds vert climat au Maroc. Nous avons profité de l'occasion d'une commission qui a été venue au Maroc pour partager avec eux, si vous voulez, ce rapport. Et nous avons même publié à travers nos outils sur tous les réseaux sociaux, ces rapports. Et ça nous a aidé un peu de structurer notre travail. Voilà un peu ce qui est très important. Je ne reviens pas revenir sur ces projets, mais surtout, nous avons beaucoup organisé de webinaires à distance. Nous avons profité de problèmes, surtout de Covid, pour que nous organisons énormément d'ateliers à distance. Nous avons aussi profité de cette, si vous voulez, boîte à outils s'impliquer dans le Fonds vert pour le climat élaboré par Germanwatch pour aussi faire une formation spéciale pour ça. C'était aussi très important. Nous avons aussi beaucoup de formations sur finance climat parce qu'à travers ces formations, nous avons aussi essayé de montrer au moins les démarches à suivre pour la population locale. Donc, ça, un peu, c'est une idée globale. Nous avons fait une plateforme, mais nous étions ouverts à l'ensemble des associations marocaines. Nous avons diffusé, si vous voulez, un appel où toutes les associations sont venues. Nous avons maintenant, si vous voulez, comment dirais-je, des datas de ces associations, c'est des données de ces associations. Nous avons organisé par la suite des forums. Ça, c'est une visite. Dans la visite, nous l'avons divisée en 2 étapes. D'abord, c'était une journée avec les acteurs locaux, avec les élus, avec aussi certaines associations, mais les visites de terrain, nous avons profité pour parler avec la population locale. Ça, c'est le projet de l'organiculture, un projet qui se fait au niveau du sud du Maroc. Ça, c'est avec aussi le projet de la région de Rachidia, la région de Qaddoussa. Je pense que notre cher de l'IRM qui est du Fonds vert connaît bien ces projets-là. Donc, croyez-moi, nous avons retenu pas mal de dysfonctionnements. Nous avons retenu pas mal de, si vous voulez, d'enseignements. Le premier enseignement que nous avons plus ou moins repéré, c'est qu'il est nécessaire que le Fonds vert climat renforce nos compétences d'abord. Parce qu'on a senti que si on n'a pas de renforcement de compétences avec les langues locales, c'est vrai que le Fonds vert climat, il diffuse les rapports, il diffuse si vous voulez, les plaintes et tout ça. Le problème de langue reste encore un grand problème pour nous parce que la population locale doit avoir des outils d'information parce qu'on a senti que le grand problème, c'est que la population locale où le projet se déroule ne sont pas informés. Donc, c'est pourquoi on a pensé à instaurer des mécanismes de bonne gouvernance pour effectivement faire informer la population locale. Nous avons aussi un problème, c'est de travailler en réseau thématique. Parce que lorsqu'on travaille sur la question de finance climat, c'est énorme, donc il faut aussi travailler finance climat. Mais le 4e point, nous avons senti qu'il est très important. Il faut que nous, société civile, il faut gagner la confiance des partenaires. Parce que, croyez-moi, maintenant, l'AFD commence à communiquer. Certains ne sont pas encore en mesure de communiquer parce qu'ils sentent qu'ils sont plus grandes que la société civile. Nous savons, nous, qui connaît un peu le mécanisme, que le rôle de la société civile, il est fondamental. La participation, il est fondamental d'après les processus du Fonds vert climat. Mais sur le terrain, c'est autre chose. C'est pourquoi on a pensé à produire des rapports et à donner des avis. Et ces avis ne sont pas en quelque sorte des plaintes, mais ce sont notre position. Voilà un peu, pour ne pas prendre beaucoup de hada, il y a beaucoup de choses à faire, mais voilà un peu en gros ce que je peux dire dans ce partage d'expérience, et merci.
Thank you very much, Saeed. So just to reiterate Saeed's point that it's very important to really gather the civil society that are all sharing the same, the common concern about the GCF, the implementation of the projects in our respective countries and region. And as Saeed has mentioned, they have gathered the CSOs, they have empowered themselves, conducted several training and webinar to really get to know more about the GCF. And from there, they are able to consolidate all the issues and concerns and submit it to the GCF. So that's the experience of Africa. I will now call on Titi Sontoro of the AXI for Gender, Social, and Economic Justice to share now about the experiences of monitoring the implementation of projects in Asia. Titi, over to you.
Thank you, Claire. May I share my screen? Okay. Thank you for having me, sharing our experience from Indonesia, part of Asia. So, good evening, everyone. I want to start that our monitoring is actually based on 8 indicators of good practice climate projects that we gathered from discussions with 10 with grassroots women from 10 climate projects in Indonesia to know what they think of good climate projects or bad climate projects. So the 8 indicators is about information disclosure, consent based on free prior informed consent, gender and environmental impact assessment, no forced displacement, respects and protect the rights of women and also environmental defenders, sensitive and transformative grievance mechanism, initiative and wisdoms of local indigenous peoples, including the indigenous women, have to be respected, recognized, and also utilized in developing projects. And also the co-benefit is not only about income, but also empowerment of women in that area. So those are the indicators that we use. And then if we look at then we start to look at the GCF project cycle, because if we want to monitor GCF, we need to monitor, we have the comprehensive pictures of that. As we see, this is from the GCF project cycle, we can see there is 10 stages of the life cycles. And then we put it in the 3 stages, actually. The stage when the project proposal goes to the NDA for the no objection letter. And then when the second stage, actually, when the project proposal is actually scrutinized by the GCF Secretariat with ITAP involved, and then discussed by the board in the board meetings. And the third stage is that is the after approval. And yeah, after then this is the scheme that we look at the first stage. In the first stage, which is actually how to monitor projects when they goes to the NDA, because we already need to have a opinion on the projects. And then the first important things to do is actually to secure the stakeholders engagement mechanism at the NDA level. We have the CSO observer engagement at the board, at the GCF board level. But at the NDA, at the national level, it's not easy. Not all CSO have the access to be engaged with the NDA. Therefore, it is important that we invite ourselves to be engaged at the NDA level. So in our case, we submit a policy recommendation to the Indonesian NDA on how to engage the CSO, the stakeholders, into the GCF projects in Indonesia. And then the projects start not only when the project's proposal comes or materialize, but it starts with the country program documents. We need to intervene since the making of the country document, country program document, because it is the master plan where all the accredited entities, national or international, will look which sectors they can invite in that country. So we need really to be involved in the drafting process. AXI and some NGOs are involved in the consultation of the draft, but not in the design from the beginning until the end. So when it was already ready, and you just need to put here and there information or input, then we were invited. But actually, we need to be involved since the conceptualized of the country program documents. And then we need to be engaged also when the project's proponent tabled their proposal to NDA for NOL. So for examples, until now we are successfully to be involved or invited by the NDA to give our input to 3 project proposals by the Pegasus and the MUFG Bank. And the last one is July 1st. There will be a project Gaia. So this is the activities at the national level that we need to pursue. And actually, we need also to pursue to be engaged for to give input if there is a accredited there is application for accreditation by the national entities. So at the board level, the strong intervention of the CSO is actually at the board level, because there is a space for that. And as we know, there is CSO active observers, and there is also CSO GCF network. They work really good and hard on give their input and intervention during project's proposal, and also the application for the accredited entities. And from 6 projects proposal related to Indonesia, AXI give intervention particularly to the global fund for coral reefs, that is more based on the FGD, the focus group discussions that we follow in Indonesia, and we give we submit also points for intervention. And we also did specifically on the Indonesian RED proposal, and for the FP083 is related to the Indonesian geothermal from the World Bank. So after, and that is the weakest part of the whole monitoring of GCF projects by the CSO, which is the post-approval. For examples, we monitor the approval of the implementation of Indonesia geothermal resource risk mitigation. You know, if we look at the NDA website, the available documents is only the documents tabled for the board consideration. There is no other information of the implementation status of the projects. If we look at the GCF, the information is also not that much. You know, it's only giving information, or there is this projects. And if we look at the what do you call it, the executing agencies website, there is a lack of information about the precise location and status of the project's implementations. If we look at the accredited entities that channel these projects, there is also lack of information about the precise location and status of the project implementation. So the information is more on financial matters than fulfillment of the safeguard. No information about the application of gender assessment, for examples, because there is an Indonesian policy regulation also related to that. And then if we look at the issue of information disclosure, and I think it is also one of the weakness of the GCF Indonesian NDA, for examples, particularly information at the national levels, where actually we have to get those information, but many information are available on short notice. The information is too general and so on. And if the important things is also at the post-approval project, it means when it is implemented, there is really lack of information about the status of the project's implementation. I would really call for our colleagues, CSO colleagues, that we really need to look at the projects after the approval by the board, how it is the status and how is actually the projects run. So the challenges that we have, that we already developed good relationship, so we are invited to the FGDs for the no objection letters, and there is also, we have a capacity to access the proposed projects and so on and so on. But our engagement is based on good relationship, but it's not institutionalized, because then if the person is not there anymore, then we will have a problem. We have to start from the beginning again. So therefore, we really want to push for institutionalize the engagement, the CSO and engagement on that. And one of the problems, the challenge we look is also that the NDA is actually weak. It seems to us that they don't have a power to decline projects proposal table for the NOL. And the other problem is actually the capacity to monitor GCF approved projects in the implementation stage. And also at the beginning, you know, at the NOL stage, you know, they don't talk about the safeguard, because some projects are financial intermediaries, you know. So then there is a need of capacity in looking at the financial issue. We are strong in the social issue, then this is also a challenge. So thank you for listening. Happy to get some question after this.
Thank you very much, Titi. So I like what you said about really establishing that relationship with your NDA, because that's the key for you to ensure the CSO engagement at all processes, from the conceptualization of funding proposals to once it is approved by the GCF to the implementation and monitoring. So that's a very important note that we can take from the experience of AXI and the CSOs in Indonesia and other groups in Asia as well. And now we're going to call on our last but not the least speaker. We have Tara Daniel from Women's Environment and Development Organization We Do, to share us more about the monitoring and the monitoring of the funding proposals using the gender lens and looking at the gender action plans of the approved funding proposals of the GC. So over to you, Tara.
Thank you so much, Claire. I'm really happy to follow TT, even though it's an unenviable position given what a wonderful framework she provides, because I think that framework is important before we zoom in here specifically, not in gender across the GCF, but how we can start assessing the implementation of gender action plans. So first, a quick reminder about gender in the GCF. The GCF should be taking a gender sensitive approach, and this has been embedded within the gender policy, most recently updated in 2019, which is accompanied by a gender action plan for actions that the Secretariat primarily would be leading on to ensure that we are seeing strong and robust gender implementation through projects. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. We do have the requirement now that there is a gender assessment and a gender action plan that's submitted as part of each funding proposal for a project or a program. And even original projects and programs that didn't have gender action plans before this was a requirement are starting to have those and develop those. The GCF provides guidance on the expectations for gender. You can see in the picture a booklet on mainstreaming gender specifically in the GCF, as well as templates for the gender assessment and gender action plan. And the last piece, which we're going to be focusing on today, is the fact that reporting is required as part of the annual performance reports that each accredited entity is submitting every year. These only become public and placed on the website usually several months after they have been submitted. So right now, we only have the 2020 APRs. We're still waiting on the 2021 APRs to be posted. What we would like to see for the way that gender is fully implemented and operationalized through project gender action plans. So we want to see this fundamental recognition that gender equality is central to the project and that it's necessary for effective climate action. We would love to see, of course, that the entire project lifecycle has been inclusive and participatory, including of feminist organizations and feminist voices, and that these are the solutions that are centering the experiences and voices of women and girls in their full diversity. However, what we can see about how this has been operationalized is instead a very limited set of information. We can really only gauge this right now through the APR. And so I have the pleasure of working with a group in Latin America and the Caribbean. There's other regional gender groups as well, but this particular group of feminist civil society that's been engaging with the GCF and is being coordinated by my colleague Natalia has been collaborating and piloting approach to a template to assess the gender action plans that are included in the proposal, in the funding proposal. And we know this that this is the most important entry point, because what accredited entities are reporting on in their APRs is their own gap. It's the plan that they set forth in their proposal. And it would not surprise many of you to know that there is a variation in the robustness and the comprehensiveness and the strength of the gender action plans that are submitted as part of proposals. So we've been piloting this review focusing on projects in Latin America that are under implementation, but we recognize that this really is a tool that can help inform future monitoring of how projects are actually being implemented on the ground. The first area that this review framework looks at is the targets. What is the goal and what are the goals that are set forth in the gender action plan? Are these goals and targets ones that recognize an intersectional approach to gender? Is there an idea that there's not a single target, but a progression of targets toward an ultimate idea of gender equality? Is this more about gender equality than it is about some tokenistic approach to representation? What we've started to see in the insights from this pilot, limited right now to 8 projects, for example, is this quote that you see from one of the projects. This has not yet been published, so I have not mentioned the exact project that this is associated with, but one of my colleagues who reviewed it said the percentages that are set in the target have no context. And then there's this opportunity that's really missed here for progressive goals as well. This project in particular has an APR for both 2019 and 2020. And I can tell you in the 2021, they report that they've exceeded these percentages. And we're left thinking, is that enough? Are these targets that focus on women's participation or that are set numbers without context really enough when we see this almost enthusiastic reporting that more than 50% of the trainees have been women, and that more than 40% of those, for example, that were consulted have been women, and that's the only information provided. So we do want to look at a broader view of gender, and we also want to look at not just where the goals are set, but how the indicators are set and what is the analysis that's really underpinning this idea. And oftentimes, as you can imagine, we're seeing that there's an over-reliance on quantitative data. And again, an approach that might overly focus on participation and representation rather than deeper dynamics that speak to gender equality. Another quote from a different project was looking at how indicators are purely quantitative and that the ones that weren't, and the targets that were more qualitative, that there was no indicator associated with them. There was that gap within the gender action plan of understanding that this actually didn't have a way of being monitored over time. We also see gaps when we start just looking at the organization of the gender action plan. Ideally, we would expect that there are deliverables and targets across activities, and that is drawing from the gender assessment, that these really relate to this closer look at the specific gender dynamics of the project area that is required as part of the proposal, and that ultimately that all of these activities would be happening throughout the project at different times, and that there would be an ability to track progress overall. Instead, some of the flaws and the limitations that we see is that there is a lack of alignment between project objectives and then having actual activities associated with those objectives. And the accredited entities are going to struggle, as we are seeing in these APRs, to actually track and report progress, especially when certain activities are only being designed to be due or finalized at the very end of a project. And most projects are at least 5 years in their lifespan. This is a quote from another set of projects, or another project, excuse me, these are both from the same projects, saying that there's objectives associated with activities that don't have a gender component. So we've really failed at what the GCF set out. In that first picture we saw about mainstreaming gender in the GCF, it hasn't been mainstreamed if there are objectives that are entirely gender blind. And furthermore, there's this idea that gender sensitization might be happening, or that there's a deeper look at gender happening. But when you look at the gender action plan in and of itself, you're seeing that there's not an actual set of activities to get you to that overarching goal. We also want to look at the type of analysis that is used. Are women truly being considered as agents of change and experts that have critical knowledge? Are we looking to feminist organizations for their knowledge? Are we looking at those local gender dynamics that should be expressed within the gender assessment? And oftentimes that's not necessarily the case. Here's an example from a project that was focused on improved cook stoves, where women were primarily viewed as beneficiaries, but there was this target set for 50% of the members of the executive committee that did have decision-making power to be women. But that there's still further questions about how true decision-making will be happening in a way that is more just and equal. So there are often aspirations that we're not actually seeing in these gender action plans. And then what's being reported, for example, this project is under implementation, but nothing has yet been reported on its gender action plan because it's too new in implementation for the accredited entity to feel that they have anything to report. We last are looking at budgeting and who is responsible for the various activities. And it is really hopeful that there is a space in the newer revised APR template that we started seeing last year to talk about the budget specifically for the gender action plan. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is being reported on. And often, when it is reported on, we are just seeing this report that, oh, the budget wasn't taken out specifically for gender. This is part of our overall budget. And here's an example of where that's happened specifically. So as we think about the limitations and the challenges, the lack of reporting, because we have such a lag of getting these APRs from when the activities are actually implemented. And what we've been able to see from the little reporting we do have is that we know that monitoring the implementation of gender does require a framework, but the gender action plans are often really inconsistent and inadequate in being able to provide that framework. And it is important to ultimately know what accredited entities are reporting against. So we have to understand these gaps and what their gaps are so that we can begin at finding out the further questions that are absolutely necessary to truly hold accredited entities accountable. But we do know for accountability, we have to have information. We have to have information about how implementation is happening on the ground. And we've had a discussion today about different ways to be in contact with accredited entities and NDAs, but we do have to recognize that the APRs right now are really the only formal way that we have insight into implementation without expending our own capacity as civil society. This is something that should be provided to us without asking year after year, but they're slow to be released and there's limitations to the information that they are providing. And that means, and I want to think about what TD was saying about advocacy happening at all levels, that it's really important that we continue to collaborate and advocate as we think throughout this entire process, from the gender action plans that are developed and submitted with funding proposals through to the templates that are used for APRs, to the information that we're getting from accredited entities and the communication that we're having with accredited entities, so that we can reach this ultimate goal of being able to improve the actual implementation of activities that will advance gender equality for all of the projects and programs that are under implementation on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tara. So thank you for reminding us that it is the GCF mandate to take the gender sensitive approach, and also for letting us know the reality that many of the funding proposals that are approved or have been considered by the board only submit their gender assessment and gender action plans for compliance without really aligning them with the goal of mainstreaming gender and advancing gender equality. And as CSOs, it's important that we continue to challenge and ensure that the gaps in the gender assessment in funding proposals are done in the right way, so that these funding proposals will be implemented the way that they should be implemented. So we have come to the end, nearing the end of our session. We only have 8 minutes left, and seeing the question and answer, the Q&A box and the chat box, I feel that we don't have much questions from our participants, unless there are a few more questions so far. I think, as I'm guessing, the question by Maria is asking for copies of the presentations of the panelists, and I think we will also circulate the copies of their presentations after the session. And seeing that there are no questions, and also looking at the time, I will now invite our panelists, before we end our session today, to give us your final remarks for this session. Probably highlight the importance of why it is important to really look at the implementation phase of the approved funding proposals of the GCF. So 1 minute, is that possible for our panelists? Just a quick final remarks. So I'll start with Berta, followed by Peter, Said, Titi, and then Tara. Now, over to you, Berta. Final remarks.
Thanks, Claire. I wasn't prepared for this, but I'll just say that I think the conclusion we can take from all of the presentations is that there's a very clear and important role from civil society organizations and communities in strengthening, the role of the GCF in promoting, especially resilience in the communities that are more affected by climate change. I mean, it is clear that despite what's already in place within the GCF in the formal structure, there is an important role for us to help improve what the works of the GCF, the workings of the GCF, through the knowledge and experience that civil societies, organizations can bring from the ground, from the reality of what these policies look like once they're actually implemented. And so I think, and I would like to invite everyone here to engage further with the GCF, if you know projects in your countries, or whether they're under implementation or in the planning phase or whatever phase they are, to engage further with them, because obviously your expertise of what happens on the ground is important to improve the GCF. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Berta. Peter?
Thanks. Yes, I think there are just 2 things I wanted to say. One is thanking the other panelists for their insight and examples into some of these specific country scenarios and the implementation that has been done thus far, which I think has been really great. And then also getting that gender lens, which I think is super important for the development and implementation of all of the GCF projects and programs. And the other thing is just to also thank the CSOs. I think we were all kind of on the same page in terms of the accountability. And I think CSOs play a big role in that and can play a big role in ensuring that all of the projects and programs are being held to the highest standard and that they are, monitored and evaluated, especially as some of the CSOs are able to provide that kind of local context, which sitting in, some of the major cities in the West, it's a bit more difficult to be able to have that exact, local ability to do the fine tuning and monitoring of projects on a more regular basis. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of opportunity, as has been mentioned by some of the other panelists, for CSO's active participation in the success of the Green Climate Fund. Back over to you, Claire. Or if Claire's not here, maybe Saïd, est-ce que vous voulez prendre la parole?
Donc, je pense que je vais enchaîner parce que selon l'ordre de la participation. Donc, à mon sens, merci pour les organisateurs de nous avoir permis de partager ces expériences. Personnellement, si quelque chose à dire, je peux dire qu'il y a un grand gap entre tout ce qui est écrit dans le processus de Fonds vert climat et tout ce qui est réalité. Et pour réduire ce gap, pour réduire un peu cette distance, il y a deux moyens. D'abord, il faut un renforcement de la société civile pour qu'il puisse jouer pleinement son rôle. Croyez-moi, il y a beaucoup de sociétés civiles qui est intéressée. Malheureusement, il n'a pas encore la connaissance, le savoir-faire, donc ils ont besoin d'un renforcement de capacité. Deuxième point, c'est très important, il faut qu'il y ait le rôle de l'accès à l'information. Nous avons un grand problème à l'accès à l'information, surtout avec bien sûr ce problème bien sûr de langue, mais il y a d'autres problèmes. C'est que la diffusion de l'information, surtout pour les agences accréditées, ils utilisent seulement le site de Fonds vert climat, mais ils n'utilisent pas d'autres sites. Il faut qu'il y ait quand même accès à l'information à travers une information qui est proactive. Donc, il ne faut pas demander l'information pour l'avoir, il faut que l'information soit proactive. Ça, c'est très important. Aussi, il faut qu'il y ait un mécanisme de suivi et d'évaluation qui n'est pas seulement ponctuel par le Fonds vert. Il faut qu'il y ait un suivi mécanisme et instaurer un système au niveau de chaque pays pour effectivement rester en relation, connaître un peu ce qui se fait dans les pays et quitte à corriger si se peut corriger à un temps exact. Voilà, merci pour cette organisation de cet atelier très intéressant.
Thank you, Saïd. Titi?
Okay, Claire, you are back. So I just want to reiterate what I already said, that we need to strengthen our monitoring capacity and our effort in monitoring the GCF projects, not only at the board stage, but important is before the proposal goes to the board, which is at the stage of the no objection letter, and also at the stage of post-approval when the projects are implemented, because we are the one have to ensure that the money of the GCF, which is actually the money to help the country and people dealing with climate change, is not the money that at the end put additional burden to the community already affected by climate change, including the women. And we need to support each other in building this capacity. Thank you, Claire and Florence and all for the opportunity. Over back to you, Claire.
Thank you, Titi. Tara?
I want to pick up where TT left off, this idea of supporting each other to build this capacity, because my takeaway is how important it is for us to continue communicating and sharing our various experiences, from the experience that TT was sharing of trying to engage in the country program, even though not necessarily early enough, to the experiences of engaging directly with accredited entities to understand their implementation at a deeper level, and understanding projects and evaluating and assessing whether or not a complaint could be and should be filed, which of course can happen at any point during the process. So I think I'm incredibly grateful for spaces such as GCF Watch and this webinar series, as well as GCF Watch as a collaborative and communicative mechanism to make sure that civil society organizations can continue learning from each other, not only in terms of their direct activities, but what different frameworks they're using, what templates they're using, as we continue to strengthen this focus on monitoring and, again, contributing, I think, as Peter highlighted really well, to ultimately the efficacy of the Green Climate Funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. And with that, looking at time, we are just 1 minute over our schedule. On behalf of the organizers of the GCF Watch webinar series, I'd like to thank our panelists who, despite their busy schedules, spent time with us in these very important webinar sessions. Many thanks, of course, to all our participants. We hope you found this session useful in your respective work, and we look forward to more engagement and participation from you, not only in examining the funding proposals tabled at every board meetings, but also in the work that is needed on the ground at the national, at the regional level. And that is by keeping an eye on the activities and implementation of the approved GCF projects in our respective countries and region. Again, thank you very much, and we hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye.